I always thought love faded with time, that it turned into something like routine, kind, familiar, maybe even comfortable, but no longer that burning, aching feeling I once knew as a boy. But then I met Harlan. We weren't related, not by blood. He was just a quiet man who lived 3 doors down at Maple Grove Assisted Living. I'd see him every morning in the garden, gently brushing the petals of the lavender bushes with his fingertips, humming something I never recognized. It wasn't until one chilly November morning that I asked him why he was always out there so early. He looked at me, smiled with his eyes more than his mouth, and simply said, "It reminds her of 1969. Her. That was Maisie. She was his wife, once radiant and witty, now a ghost of herself, bound to a wheelchair, her eyes more clouded than the fog that often rolled through the garden paths. Alzheimer's had come like a thief in the night and taken pieces of her day by day, year by year. But Harlan, he never left her side. Every morning he helped her into her sweater. Every afternoon he read the same book aloud, even though she never seemed to follow the words. Every evening he brushed her hair, whispering stories of their youth, as if maybe, just maybe, one of them might pull her back for a moment. Sometimes she screamed at him, told him to go away. Sometimes she cried like a child in his arms. But he never raised his voice, never stepped back. He'd only say, "It's not her fault. It's the forgetting." The nurses said most men didn't last. They meant well, but many couldn't handle the slow disappearing act Alzheimer's played. Watching the one you love become a stranger, it undoes something in you. But not Harlan. He held on tighter the more she slipped away. I once asked him why he stayed when Maisie didn't even know who he was anymore. He looked out over the garden, voice like worn leather. Because love isn't about being recognized. It's about recognizing them, even when they're lost. He told me about the first time he met Maisie, in the summer of '69. She wore yellow daisies in her hair, barefoot on the lake shore, reading The Bell Jar. He fell in love before she even looked up. They had one summer together, just one. He was drafted in September. They made a promise before he left, a phrase only they understood. Forever starts late. It meant that even if life got in the way, even if they were torn apart, someday they'd find each other again, and when they did, they'd begin. He returned from Vietnam 3 years later, and she was still there, waiting, just like she'd said. They married in a small chapel with broken pews and wildflowers for decoration. She laughed when he tripped on the vows. He whispered that promise again as he slipped the ring on her finger. Forever starts late. Now, decades later, she couldn't remember his name, but he still whispered it to her. Every night. Maisie, my Maisie. Some days she thought he was a nurse. Other days, a stranger. Once she called him Papa, and he just smiled and kissed her forehead. But the hardest day was when she looked at him and asked, "Do you know where Harlan went? He was my husband. He was kind." I watched him crumble just slightly, shoulders dipping, jaw tightening, but he kissed her hand and said, "Yes, darling, he's always been here." He held on because he believed, deep down in a place untouched by time or disease, that somewhere in her, Maisie still held the memory of that summer, of the lakeshore, of barefoot promises and wildflowers. That belief gave him strength, but even that kind of love has its breaking points. He started to forget things himself, left the stove on one afternoon, lost his balance helping her into bed, but he never let anyone else take over. "I remember enough for both of us," he'd say. There was a heaviness to his devotion, a kind of beauty that felt almost unbearable to witness. I often left their room with tears I didn't expect. It wasn't sadness alone, it was something deeper, like witnessing a man holding the last light of a sunset with his bare hands. But nothing could have prepared me, or him, for what she said that night, a whisper, barely audible, but it would change everything. The night it happened, the facility was quieter than usual. Rain tapped gently against the windows, the kind of soft, steady rhythm that could lull the hardest heart into remembering. Harlan sat in his usual spot, an old armchair with worn arms and a cushion that had molded itself to the shape of his patience. Across from him, Maisie lay tucked into her hospital bed, her breathing shallow but steady. She'd had a rough day. The nurse said she'd refused food again, turned her face to the wall, and wouldn't speak. Harlan hadn't said much either. He just held her hand, fingers laced with hers like the first time they kissed, under the bleachers of her high school gymnasium during the town's 4th of July dance. He looked at her face, still so beautiful to him even now. The lines of age had softened into something almost serene, and though her eyes no longer sparked the way they had when she'd been a 20-year-old firecracker of a woman, he still saw her there, buried deep beneath the fog. "Do you remember the lake, Maisie?" he asked softly. "The one with the old dock and the dragonflies in the heat? You used to chase them, laughing so loud people thought you were drunk on summer." No answer, just the rise and fall of her chest. "I told you I loved you there, you know. You said I was too young to know what love meant, but I knew. I knew it because it hurt when you looked away, and it healed when you looked back." The room smelled faintly of lavender. Harlan had brought in some sachets from the garden that morning, tucking them in her pillowcases. "You always said lavender meant home," he whispered. He watched the rain for a while. Time didn't move quite the same inside those walls. It stretched and folded in on itself. Minutes could feel like hours. Years could disappear in a blink. Suddenly, Maisie stirred. Not much, just a twitch of her fingers around his. Harlan looked down. Her eyes were open, but different. There was something aware, alert. For the first time in months, maybe longer, she looked straight at him, not through him. "Maisie," he breathed, "can you hear me, sweetheart?" Her lips moved, but no sound came. She swallowed, tried again, and then, barely louder than the rain, she whispered, "Forever starts late." Harlan froze. For a moment he thought he imagined it, that his mind, so desperate for connection, had tricked him. But then she said it again, this time with a trembling smile. "Forever starts late," she said. He felt the world tilt. That phrase, those 3 simple words, hadn't passed between them in over 5 decades. Not since the day he came back from Vietnam and she was waiting on that cracked porch in a yellow dress. He fell to his knees beside her bed. "Maisie, it's me. It's Harlan." She reached out, slow, fragile, uncertain, but her fingers brushed his cheek. "I know," she said, eyes suddenly shining with clarity. "You came back," he sobbed. Not the quiet tears of earlier days, but a raw, broken cry from the bottom of his soul. Because in that one impossible moment, Maisie had returned to him, even if only for a breath, even if only for a night. "Don't go," he whispered. "Please, stay." She smiled again, gently, like she had when she was 22 and too wise for her age. "Don't worry, my love," she said. "I waited before. I'll wait again." She closed her eyes, her hand still resting on his. Harlan didn't sleep that night. He just watched her, held her hand, and replayed the whisper over and over in his mind. "Forever starts late." The next morning came gently, with a pale golden light spilling through the blinds. It felt different, like the air itself was holding its breath. Harlan hadn't moved from the side of Maisie's bed. His fingers were still wrapped around hers, now limp in sleep, but warm. He hadn't dared close his eyes. Not after what she'd said, not after hearing that sacred phrase, "Forever starts late," rise from her lips like it had been waiting all those years to be spoken one last time. Part of him was terrified that it had been a dream, that sleep had played a cruel trick on him. But her voice still rang in his ears, fragile and clear. She had looked at him, seen him, called him home. The nurse knocked softly on the door. "Mr. Palmer, do you want some breakfast?" He barely turned his head. "No, thank you." She nodded, glanced at Maisie, and froze for half a second. Something flickered in her eyes. Worry? But she didn't say anything. Just gave him a thin smile and gently shut the door. He looked at Maisie again. How many times had he stared at her, trying to remember every line of her face before memory could steal even that? There were times he feared he'd forget too. Forget the exact way she tucked her chin when she laughed, or the way she said "darlin'," like it was the most natural word in the world. He used to think love was about presence, about 2 people walking side by side through life. But he'd learned something different in the last 10 years. That real love, lasting love, is about remembrance, about holding someone inside you when they can't hold themselves anymore. When Maisie's memory began to fray, he took on the burden quietly. No complaints, no drama, just slow, steady care. He wrote notes for her on yellow sticky pads, labeled family pictures, repeated stories with the patience of a grandfather reading to a toddler. She would smile politely, confused, often asking, "Do I know you?" Each time, it broke him just a little more, but he never showed it. He would only say, "I know you." He remembered everything she forgot. Her favorite song, her mother's maiden name, the way she used to sing in the kitchen while burning toast. He carried all of it for her, as if, somehow, by remembering hard enough, he could protect those pieces of her from fading completely. He once overheard someone say it was pointless, that the woman he loved was already gone. But they were wrong, because last night, for one brief, sacred moment, she came back. That moment played on repeat in his mind, like an old film reel flickering behind his eyes. The way her lips had formed those words, the way her eyes had locked onto his, not as a stranger's, but as his Maisie, his forever. Suddenly, she stirred. He sat up quickly, hope surging like a wave. "Maisie." She turned her head slightly, her breath shallow, but her eyes remained closed. "I'm here," he whispered, brushing a strand of white hair from her forehead. "You're safe." Her mouth moved slightly. No words this time, just breath. A whisper lost in the room's stillness. He leaned in close, desperate to hear anything, but nothing came. Still, he smiled, because he had something now, a memory not just of who she had been, but of who she still was, somewhere deep inside. And that was enough. He looked over at the photo on the nightstand, a black and white snapshot of them in 1969, arms around each other on a picnic blanket, laughing like the world had no plans of ever being cruel. He took the photo and held it next to her hand. "Do you remember this, Maisie? We were just kids. You had daisies in your hair and dirt on your knees, and I thought no woman in the world had ever looked more perfect." He chuckled softly, tears in his eyes. "You told me I had big ears and clumsy feet, and I said, 'Good thing you're not marrying my ears then.' You rolled your eyes and kissed me anyway." She didn't respond, but he saw the tiniest twitch at the corner of her mouth. Or maybe he imagined it. It didn't matter, because in that quiet room, in the company of fading memories and eternal love, Harlan held fast to the belief that what they'd shared wasn't lost. Not really. It lived in the spaces between words, in whispers, in the way her hand still fit perfectly in his after all these years. As the morning light grew brighter, he kissed her fingers and whispered again, "Forever starts late, my love, but it's still forever." 3 days passed. Maisie didn't speak again. Not another whisper, not another moment of clarity, just the quiet rhythm of her breath and the stillness that now defined her days. Yet to Harlan, something had shifted, something invisible, yet real. He kept thinking of that moment, that phrase. Those 3 words she had somehow carried through the storm of her illness like a message in a bottle across the sea of years. Forever starts late. He couldn't help but wonder, was it truly her? Did something in the music of their love, their shared past, awaken her? And so, on a soft Saturday afternoon, Harlan did something he hadn't done in years. He opened the old wooden chest at the foot of their bed, the one Maisie used to call the memory box. Inside were photos, letters, ticket stubs, even dried wildflowers from their honeymoon in Tennessee. But at the very bottom, wrapped in a silk scarf that still faintly smelled of her perfume, was the thing he'd been looking for, the vinyl record, their song. He took it gently, as if touching it too fast might break the fragile connection between past and present. The nurses helped him bring an old portable player into the room. He set it beside her bed, heart thudding in his chest like a young man asking a girl to dance for the first time. With shaking hands, he placed the needle. The crackle came first, soft, familiar, like an old friend clearing their throat. Then the first notes of "Since I Fell for You" by Lenny Welch filled the room. That voice, mournful, rich, timeless, floated like a warm breeze through the sterile air. Harlan sat beside Maisie and took her hand. "I played this the night I left for basic training," he said, voice catching in his throat. "You cried into my shirt and said, 'If you die, I'll kill you.' And I said, 'If I die, I'll wait for you on the other side.'" She didn't move, but he kept talking. "We danced to this at our wedding, remember? In that tiny hall with the broken floorboards. I stepped on your toes so many times and you still said it was the best night of your life." The song played on. He watched her face, searching for even the faintest flicker. Then her lips parted. Not to speak, but to breathe a little deeper. Her chest rose, then fell, as if something inside her stirred with the music. Tears welled in Harlan's eyes. "Do you hear it, Maisie?" he whispered. "It's us. It's still us." He rested his forehead against her hand. "You said you'd find me if we ever got lost. Well, here I am, darling. I never moved. I never left." He stayed like that until the song ended, then played it again and again. He played it until the sun slipped away and the room was wrapped in twilight. That night, he left the record player running softly in the background. He didn't expect miracles. But somehow, he believed that music, their music, had found its way into whatever corner of her mind was still untouched by the forgetting. Before he fell asleep in the chair, he whispered again, "Forever starts late, Maisie." But we're still on time. The next morning, something unusual happened. One of the younger nurses, Avery, knocked gently on Harlan's door holding a yellowed envelope in her hand. She looked unsure, nervous even, as if she wasn't sure she should be the one to bring it. "I found this in a stack of old files that got misfiled," she said. "It was in a folder labeled Personal Effects, M. Palmer. I think it's meant for you." Harlan took the envelope slowly, staring at the faded handwriting. It was unmistakable, Maisie's. The envelope was addressed to Harlan Palmer, PFC, U.S. Army, and postmarked 1970. It had never been opened. His hands trembled as he peeled back the flap, the paper thin and delicate with age. Inside was a single folded sheet, written in her familiar looping script, the same one she used for grocery lists and love notes tucked into his lunchbox. He began to read. "Dearest Harlan, if this letter reaches you, it means I finally found the courage to send it. I've written it 5 times and burned each one. This time I won't, I promise. I miss you more than words can hold. The nights are the hardest. I sleep with your shirt under my pillow and listen to the wind like maybe it's carrying your voice home. I keep thinking about what you said before you left, that forever starts late. At first I didn't understand. I thought you meant we'd wait until after the war, but now I think I get it. You meant love doesn't always arrive when we want it to, but when it does, we fight to keep it, even if time tries to steal it. So I'm fighting, Harlan. I'm fighting to hold on to you with every letter I write, every song I play, every prayer I whisper. If you come home, I'll be waiting. If you don't, I'll still be waiting, even then. You once asked me if I believed in soulmates. I didn't answer you then. I was scared. But I'll answer now. Yes, forever starts late, but it's still forever. All my love." Maisie Harlan couldn't move. He couldn't even breathe. It was like hearing her voice again from another lifetime, a version of her untouched by illness, untouched by time, a young woman pouring her whole heart onto paper, never knowing if the man she loved would live to read it. He pressed the letter to his chest, tears streaming down his face. "Why didn't this reach me?" he whispered. "I needed this. I needed this all these years." But then, maybe it was never meant to come then. Maybe, just like Maisie's whispered words a few nights ago, the letter had arrived exactly when it was supposed to. Not during war, not during worry, but now, at the end of a life lived with devotion, through memory and forgetting, through silence and song. Later that afternoon, he sat beside her again, letter in hand, and read it aloud to her, slowly, gently, as if she were still writing it and he were hearing it for the first time. When he finished, he looked into her face. No response. No smile, but he didn't need one, because he had her voice now, not just in memory, but in ink, in truth. And that night, as he folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it on the nightstand, he whispered again, "I got your message, Maisie. 45 years late, but right on time." The following week passed in gentle stillness. Maisie slept more. Her breaths became lighter, less rhythmic. Harlan noticed the change, though no one said the words aloud. Not yet, but he knew. After all they'd been through, wars, decades, silence, and even forgetting, he knew how to read time's final signs. He didn't fight it, he just stayed. One afternoon, he asked the nurses for a small favor. They helped rearrange the room. They moved her hospital bed slightly to the side and cleared the floor near the window. Harlan pulled out the small record player once more. He'd brought more of their old records now. He flipped through them gently, like touching memories he hadn't dared open in years. And then he found the one. Moon River. He set the needle down, and that soft, melancholic melody filled the room. A song about drifting, about dreams, about something beautiful and unreachable, just like them. He turned to Maisie, who lay so still in her bed. Her eyes fluttered open, just barely, but she didn't focus. She hadn't said a word in days. Still, Harlan walked over slowly, his joints aching but his heart strong. "Would you dance with me, Mrs. Palmer?" he asked softly, voice trembling. Of course she didn't answer, but that didn't matter. He gently lifted her hand, light as paper now, and placed it on his chest. Then he wrapped one arm around her shoulders and swayed, barely moving, just enough to feel the song in his bones. He closed his eyes and let the music carry him back, to that tiny high school dance floor, to their wedding, to the kitchen on a Sunday morning where she danced barefoot in her robe, holding a coffee cup and humming. He held her now, like he held her then, like she was everything. "I remember every step," he whispered. "You always led, even when I thought I was." His eyes filled with tears, but he smiled. "You saved the last dance for me, didn't you?" The music swirled, and for one fleeting second, he thought he felt her grip tighten. He looked down, startled, but her hand was as still as before. A trick of the heart? Perhaps. But Harlan believed in more than tricks. He believed in love that didn't need permission to linger, love that danced, even when the body couldn't. As the final note faded, he kissed her forehead, held her close, and whispered the words again. "Forever starts late." He sat back down in the chair, holding her hand until the room grew dim, and just before the nurses came to check in, something shifted in the air. A stillness that wasn't just sleep. Maisie's chest had stilled. She was gone. No struggle, no fear, just gone. But she hadn't left alone, because her last memory, the one that stayed, even as everything else fell away, was of a man who never stopped loving her, a man who waited, who remembered, who danced. The days after Maisie's passing were wrapped in a kind of silence Harlan had never known before, not just the absence of her voice or the quiet that settled in their shared room, but something deeper, an internal stillness. As if a great part of him had gone with her, and the world had forgotten to fill the space she left behind. The nurses were kind. They brought tea. They sat with him in soft moments and let him cry without asking questions. But nothing they did could replace what he'd lost. Because how do you go on when the person you've held for a lifetime simply isn't anymore? The room looked almost the same. The record player was still on the table. The flowers he'd brought her were beginning to wilt. Her hairbrush still held a few strands of silver. He touched the bed where she had lain. Still made, still warm in memory. And then he saw it. The letter, still resting on the nightstand. The one she wrote in 1970. The one he never received until just days before she left him. He picked it up again, gently, and unfolded it. The ink was slightly smudged where his tears had fallen. He read it through once more, then a second time, as if trying to memorize the curve of each letter, the rhythm of her hand. And then he did something he never thought he'd do. He wrote back. He pulled out an old notebook from his drawer, the one he'd once used for grocery lists and idle sketches, and began to write a reply as if she might somehow hear him. "My Maisie, you waited for me. I didn't know it then, but I see it now. You waited through war, through years, through illness, through forgetting. And I waited too. I waited for that night, when you said our words again, when you came back to me, if only for a moment. That was the gift I didn't know I'd been hoping for. I held you through so many storms, but in the end, you were the one who held me. Even now, your letter holds me. I don't know what forever looks like, but I believe in it now, because you taught me that forever doesn't need to begin when we're young and full of fire. Sometimes it begins in the quiet, in the late years, in the final breath, and that's still forever. Wait for me, my love, just a little while longer. When I see you again, save me a dance. All my love, Harlan." He folded the letter and placed it next to hers. Side by side, as they had been for a lifetime. He didn't cry that night, not in the way people expected. The tears had already been cried in the years of caregiving, in the lonely mornings, in the silent heartbreak of being forgotten. What remained now was peace, a kind of sacred stillness, the kind that comes when you know, without doubt, that you gave your whole heart, that love, real love, had lived there, and that somewhere beyond the veil of memory and time, it still did. Weeks passed. The seasons began to shift. The once warm afternoons turned crisp, and the leaves outside Maple Grove painted the sidewalks in hues of amber and rust. Life moved on in quiet, predictable rhythms. Meals, checkups, visits from volunteers. But for Harlan, everything had changed. Yet something inside him refused to fade. Not completely. It would have been easy to disappear into the shadows of grief, to turn inward and live only in the past. And, for a while, he did. He visited her grave every morning, brought fresh lavender from the garden, and sat in silence with his thermos of coffee. Just the two of them, as it had always been. But one morning, something shifted. He noticed an elderly woman, new to the home, struggling to open a carton of milk in the dining hall. Her hands trembled. She looked embarrassed, glancing around to see if anyone had noticed. Harlan stood, walked over slowly, and opened it for her without a word. She smiled. "Thank you, kind sir." He nodded, tipping his cap. "You're welcome, ma'am." That was all. But later that day she joined him on the bench outside the garden. No conversation, just quiet company. And somehow, that quiet felt familiar. Not like Maisie, but not empty either. Like a book waiting to be opened again after a long time on the shelf. Over the following days, others began to sit with him too. A man who had lost his wife 2 years earlier. A woman whose daughter no longer called. They came not for advice, but for presence. For warmth. For the kind of gentle strength Harlan now wore without realizing. He began to share stories. Not dramatic speeches. Just fragments. Small, meaningful pieces of a love story that had defied time, illness, and silence. He told them about Maisie's laugh, about their first dance, about the letter she never sent, and eventually about her whisper that night. "Forever starts late," he told them one morning, voice steady. "But it's still forever." They listened, not with pity, but with reverence, because they too had known late love, or long love, or lost love, and in Harlan's story they found parts of their own. It wasn't healing, not exactly. The wound of loss doesn't close like a cut, but something in it began to soften, to breathe again. One afternoon, Harlan returned to his room and found a note taped to his door. Written in unsteady handwriting were the words, "Thank you for remembering for all of us. Marjorie." He read it 3 times, then placed it next to the letters from Maisie. Another layer of love, another thread in the tapestry she had started. And that night, as he looked out over the garden where the last lavender had begun to wilt, he whispered into the wind, "I'm still dancing, Maisie. One slow step at a time." It was a Sunday morning when the director of Maple Grove approached Harlan with an idea. They wanted to host a community night, an evening for residents and their families to share memories, music, and stories of love that had shaped their lives. Something gentle, something meaningful. "We were wondering," the director said, "if you'd consider sharing your story about Maisie." Harlan didn't answer right away. Part of him wanted to protect what they'd had, to keep it tucked away like a secret folded into a pocket. But another part of him, the part that still heard her whisper in dreams, knew she would have said yes. So he agreed. The night arrived, modest and warm. String lights draped over the common room. Folding chairs, soft music, and paper lanterns swaying gently in the breeze from open windows. Residents brought old photos. Some even wore dresses or suits they hadn't touched in years. Harlan came last. He walked slowly to the front, carrying nothing but a single lavender sprig and 2 letters, hers and his. He didn't use a microphone, didn't need one. He stood, cleared his throat, and spoke from the place Maisie had always lived inside him. "I was married to Maisie for 53 years, he began. "But if you'd asked her, she would have told you our forever started late, because I left for war before we could marry, and when I came home, she was still there, waiting, He paused. She lived with Alzheimer's the last decade of her life. I stayed with her every day. Some folks told me she was already gone, that there was no point staying. His voice cracked, but he steadied it. But they were wrong. Because love, real love, doesn't need to be recognized. It just needs to be given. Over and over. He shared how she whispered their secret phrase, how that moment gave him everything he didn't know he was still hoping for, and how he received a letter from her, written 45 years earlier, that reached him just days before she passed. She said forever starts late, he repeated softly. And it does. Sometimes love comes after loss. Sometimes it blooms in the dusk, not the dawn. But that doesn't make it any less real. In fact, it might make it more. Silence filled the room. And then, quiet applause. Not loud, not performative, just warm and genuine. Eyes wet, heads bowed. Later that evening, a teenage girl approached him with her grandmother. The girl's eyes were shining. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," she said. "Can I write it down?" Harlan smiled. "Of course, sweetheart. But promise me one thing." She nodded. "Someday, when you love someone, tell them early. And if you're lucky enough to grow old with them, tell them again and again." He gave her the lavender sprig. "Forever might start late," he whispered, "but don't wait to begin." Winter came quietly to Maple Grove. The snow settled on the windowsills like a soft blanket, and the garden where Harlan once gathered lavender lay dormant under a pale sky. The world slowed down, and the days grew shorter, but inside Harlan, something had begun to warm. It wasn't happiness, not in the way people usually meant it. It was something gentler, quieter, a peace that arrived not with fanfare, but with understanding. He still visited Maisie's grave every morning, still brought her lavender when he could find it, or dried flowers from the local shop when the garden slept. He'd sit beside her headstone, read the paper aloud, and update her on the new residents who had moved in. Sometimes he read her favorite poems. Sometimes he just sat and listened to the wind, and though the chair beside him remained empty, he never felt alone. One morning, he found a note taped to the bench he usually sat on. "Harlan, you reminded us that love doesn't fade. It deepens. Thank you for showing us what forever looks like. The staff at Maple Grove." He tucked it into his coat pocket and patted it gently. Later that week, he noticed a change in the way others spoke to him. They didn't ask how he was holding up anymore. They started asking what Maisie might have said about the snowfall, or what she would have thought about the holiday decorations, as if she still lived among them, and maybe she did. Not in the fading photos or dusty mementos, but in the way people now sat longer at breakfast, shared their stories more freely, or reached for each other's hands during quiet moments. Love had become contagious. One night, as the snow began to fall again, Harlan sat by the window in his room, the record player spinning softly in the corner. Moon River filled the space like a lullaby from the past. He opened his drawer and took out the two letters, hers and his, folded them together, and then, carefully, placed them in a small box with a label, "For someone who believes." He left it with the director the next morning. No explanation, just a simple request. Give this to someone when the time is right. As he walked out into the garden, the cold biting at his cheeks, he looked up at the sky, pale and wide and full of quiet stars. "I'll see you soon, Maisie," he whispered, but not just yet. He placed one last sprig of lavender in the soil, smiled softly, and turned back toward the warmth of the home where love still lived, not in the past, not in memory alone, but here, now, always. Because sometimes, forever, doesn't start late, it just never ends. Some stories don't need dramatic endings to stay with us. They linger in the soft spaces, between a whispered word, a song long forgotten, and the quiet hand of someone who simply never let go. Harlan and Maisie taught us that love isn't defined by perfect timing or flawless memory. It's defined by presence, by patience, by the promise that even when everything else fades, the heart remembers. So now we ask you, have you ever held on to a love that time tried to take away? Is there someone you would wait a lifetime for? Or who waited for you? What does forever mean to you? Now, after hearing their story, We invite you to share your own memories in the comments of late love, true love, second chances, and moments that surprised you. You never know who might need to read your story today. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel for more real love stories, and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. And tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach, because no matter where you are, love finds its way, even if forever starts late.